The winter of 1898 descended on the San Juan Mountains of Colorado not as a blanket, but as a hammer. In the high valleys, where the air was thin and the silver mines had gone bust, temperatures of 20 degrees below Fahrenheit were not a catastrophe. They were merely the baseline for December. For the crew working for Silas Croft, laying the foundation for a new railroad spur line shack near the Animas River, the cold was a physical enemy. Croft, a man who built by the principles of mass and might, watched his men struggle to stack 12-inch spruce logs, their gloved hands clumsy, their breath freezing instantly on their beards. Their existing bunkhouse, a standard-issue 20 by 30 log structure built only 3 months prior at a cost of $400, was a fortress of failure. Inside, a pot-bellied stove roared, consuming a quarter cord of precious hand-sawn pine every day. Yet the bunks near the walls were layered in frost. 3 miles up the canyon, in a derelict-looking structure barely qualifying as a cabin, Arthur Wallace sat in a chair, reading a book. The wind howled outside his thin board and batten walls, but inside, the air was still. A thermometer hanging from a rafter, well away from his small masonry heater, read a consistent 64 degrees Fahrenheit, or 17.8 Celsius. His cabin, purchased for $99 from a bank foreclosure, looked like a stiff wind would demolish it. His neighbors, when they saw him, pitied him, but while Croft's crew burned through their woodpile with desperate speed, Wallace's weekly fuel consumption was less than what the railroad crew used in a single morning. The secret wasn't in the cabin, it was in what the $99 purchase receipt called the basement. A dark, flooded, 200-foot-deep mine shaft that the entire county had dismissed as a worthless, dangerous hole. What did this quiet, unassuming engineer understand about geology and the fundamental laws of heat transfer that an entire industry of practical builders had completely missed? The panic of 1893 had shattered the high country. Silver, the region's lifeblood, became nearly worthless overnight. Boom towns turned to ghost towns, and the only men left were the stubborn, the desperate, or those tied to the infrastructure that remained, the railroads. The conventional wisdom for survival in this environment was written in log and stone. The manuals provided by the railroad companies and the local traditions passed down from the first prospectors were identical. Build heavy. A proper mountain cabin, the kind Silas Croft championed, was a statement of brute force. It started with a foundation of dry stacked granite. The walls were to be no less than 10 inches thick, preferably 12, using the largest spruce or pine logs available. The gaps, or chinking, were to be filled with a mixture of mud, horsehair and lime. The roof needed a steep pitch to shed snow, built with heavy rafters and covered in split cedar shakes or, if you were poor, thick sod. The centerpiece was the stove, a massive cast-iron round oak or monarch heater costing upwards of $30, designed to radiate immense immediate heat. The philosophy was simple. The cold was an invading army, and you repelled it with a fortress and a bigger fire. This methodology cost a fortune in time and resources. A single cabin like Croft's required felling nearly an acre of old-growth forest, hundreds of man-hours in logging and shaping, and a constant, voracious appetite for fuel, demanding anywhere from 10 to 15 cords of wood to survive a single winter. To suggest anything else was seen as lazy, foolish, or dangerously naive. The failure of this brute force method was not a matter of if, but when. Silas Croft's new bunkhouse was a perfect case study in flawed design. The 20 by 30-foot structure, with its impressive 14-inch log walls, had been completed in October. The 600 man-hours spent hauling and fitting the logs had been celebrated as a testament to hard work. But the physics were inescapable. The logs themselves, while massive, were poor insulators once they became saturated with cold. Their R value, the measure of thermal resistance, was barely 1.5 per inch, giving the entire wall an R value of only R21, a figure easily compromised. The real culprit was thermal bridging and air infiltration. Every massive spike holding the structure together acted as a conduit, drawing the 20-degree for cold, 28.9 C, deep into the wood. The chinking, a mixture of mud and lime, froze, contracted, and developed thousands of microscopic cracks. The wind, pressurized by the topography of the canyon, forced itself through these cracks at high velocity. Inside, the $35 Monarch stove was a thermodynamic catastrophe. To keep the fire roaring hot enough to combat the drafts, its damper was kept wide open, pulling enormous volumes of heated air the men had just paid for with wood, straight up the 8-inch stovepipe. The result? 5 feet from the stove, the temperature was a blistering 80 degrees, 26.7. 10 feet away, at the bunks, the temperature was 38 degrees, 3.3 degrees. Frost coated the nail heads on the interior walls. The windows were opaque with ice. The men slept in their coats, developed hacking coughs, and their productivity on the rail line plummeted. Croft blamed the poor quality wood, the laziness of the stove stoker, the unprecedented cold. He never once blamed the design. Arthur Wallace was not a frontiersman by birth. He was an engineer, trained in the anthracite mines of eastern Pennsylvania. His formative years were spent not in wide open spaces, but deep underground, where the primary concerns were not cold, but air. He had studied mine ventilation, water management, and the dangers of black damp, the suffocating buildup of carbon dioxide. His most profound lesson, however, came from the earth itself. Every day, descending into the shafts, he left the 90-degree summer heat or the 10-degree winter chill and entered a world of absolute thermal stability. 300 feet below the surface, the rock temperature was a constant, unwavering 52 degrees, 11.1 degrees, all day, every day. He understood, in a way the log builders did not, that the earth was not an enemy to be walled off, but an enormous, free, thermal battery. His career was cut short by a lung condition, and he moved west not for silver, but for the dry, thin air. He had also spent a year in Austria, observing the Kachelofen, or masonry heater. These tiled stoves didn't just radiate heat, they stored it, burning small, hot fires for 2 hours and then releasing the warmth gently for the next 20. When he arrived in Colorado, he saw the brute force cabins and the belching stovepipes as symbols of profound waste. He was ridiculed. Silas Croft had famously called him a book learner with no practical sense. When Wallace bought the foreclosed Eureka load claim for $99, Croft and his men laughed. The cabin was a 12 by 16-foot shack, barely more than a shed, and it sat atop a notoriously wet mine shaft, flooded and useless for mining. Wallace, they said, had bought his own tomb. Wallace arrived at his property in late August with a mule, $200 in remaining capital, and a plan. The cabin itself was indeed a wreck. The board and batten siding was loose, the roof was patched with tin, and the floor was simple planking. But Wallace barely looked at it. He went straight to the basement, a 6 by 6-foot trapdoor in the center of the floor. He opened it, and instead of a cellar, there was a black void. The smell of damp earth and mineral-rich water rose to meet him. Lighting a lantern and lowering it on a rope, he confirmed his calculations. The shaft was timbered, square set, and descended 198 feet before meeting the water table. The water itself was dark, still, and as he knew from geologic maps, a constant 45 decades, 7.2 decades. The unbelievable secret wasn't gold. It was this vast, accessible heat sink. He spent his $200 not on logs or a new stove, but on 300 feet of 8-inch galvanized stovepipe, 100 feet of 2-inch iron pipe, 2 barrels of solder, and several rolls of insulating wool felt. He spent September not rebuilding the walls, but working in the shaft. He assembled the 8-inch pipe into 2 long ducts. He built a complex, radiator-like coil from the 2-inch pipe. To the locals, his behavior was baffling. He was ignoring the coming winter, tinkering, as Croft called it. While others were splitting wood, Wallace was hanging by a rope in a dark hole, soldering pipes. His cabin looked just as fragile as before, but the system, the real structure, was being assembled where no one could see it. The philosophical divide was absolute. Silas Croft, representing conventional wisdom, believed in brute force insulation. His method was to stack mass, to build a fortress so thick that the cold simply could not penetrate. It was a war of attrition, fought with material. If the cabin was cold, the solution was simple. Build thicker walls, burn more wood. The concept of efficiency was alien. Endurance was the virtue. Croft's method was visible, tangible, and deeply appealing to the frontier mindset. Arthur Wallace, in contrast, was a proponent of thermal management. He saw the problem through the lens of thermodynamics. He knew the cold would get in. It was a law of physics. The goal was not to stop the unstoppable, but to control the rate of heat loss and to replenish that heat intelligently. His entire philosophy rested on two principles Croft ignored. One, the Earth's stable temperature is a free and limitless source of preheated energy. Two, heat should be generated efficiently and stored within the living envelope, thermal mass, not instantly radiated and lost up a chimney. When Croft rode by in October and saw Wallace's thin-walled shack, he shook his head in genuine pity. "That's a July cabin, Wallace," he shouted over the wind. "You'll be a block of ice by Christmas." Arthur just nodded, securing another length of wool felt around a pipe emerging from his floor. In late November, Mr. Hayes arrived. Hayes was a surveyor for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, a man of cold logic, ruled by data, transits, and log tables. His small team was tasked with mapping the High Canyon for a potential spur line, and they needed winter quarters. He carried with him a new, expensive alcohol thermometer, accurate to 1/10 of a degree, and a sling psychrometer to measure relative humidity. His first stop was Croft's new bunkhouse, the standard for the region. He recorded the data in his logbook. Outside temperature, 15 degrees, 26.1 degrees. Interior temperature, average, 42 degrees, 5.5 degrees. Humidity, 12%, critically dry. Fuel consumption, 0.22 cords of pine day. Notes, extreme temperature stratification, heavy smoke, soot. Crew exhibits persistent respiratory distress. Disappointed, Hayes rode to Wallace's tomb, expecting to find a frozen hermit. He knocked. Wallace opened the door in his shirt sleeves. The warmth that escaped was gentle, not the baking heat of an inefficient stove. Hayes, stunned, asked to take readings. Outside temperature, 15 degrees. Interior temperature, average, 62 degrees, 16.7 degrees. Humidity, 45%, comfortable. Fuel consumption, 0.03 cords day, estimated. Hayes was incredulous. He checked his instruments. He looked at the tiny, slow-burning masonry heater. "Where is your stove?" he asked. Wallace pointed. "That's it. But this is impossible," Hayes said. Wallace smiled and pointed to the trapdoor. "The stove just adds the last few degrees, Mr. Hayes. The real work is done in the basement." At Hayes's insistence, Wallace explained the system. It was not just a cabin. It was a 5-layer integrated geothermal engine. The unbelievable secret was a passive thermosiphon driven by the temperature differential between the deep earth and the surface. Layer 1 was the air intake. Wallace had built a baffled, rock-filled cold sink 50 feet away from the cabin. Air entering this intake was drawn down a 10-inch buried pipe. Layer 2 was the geothermal preheater. The 10-inch pipe ducted the 15-degree air down the 198-foot mine shaft, completely separate from the living space. At the bottom, this cold air was fed into the large radiator-like coil made of 2-inch pipe. Layer 3 was the heat exchanger. This entire coil was submerged in the 45 degrees, 7.2 degrees mine water. As the 15-degree air passed through the 100-foot-long coil, it had no choice but to absorb heat from the water. The Earth's battery warmed it. The water near the coil might chill slightly, but the immense thermal mass of the surrounding rock and water table would instantly replenish it. Layer 4 was the hot air return. A separate, insulated 8-inch pipe brought the now warmed air up from the coil. When Hayes placed his thermometer at the floor grate, the air entering the cabin from the shaft registered 38 degrees, 3.3 degrees Celsius. Wallace was taking 15 degrees for air and with zero fuel, warming it by 53 degrees. Layer 5 was the booster. The cabin's only heat source was a small, efficient masonry stove Wallace had built from soapstone and fire brick. Its job was not to fight 15 degrees Celsius cold, but merely to raise 38 degrees Celsius air to a comfortable 62 degrees Celsius. It required a tiny hot fire for just 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening. The masonry mass absorbed this heat and radiated it gently all day. The system breathed. The draw from the stove's chimney helped pull the air through the loop, making it a self-perpetuating, stable thermal engine. In early February 1899, the Great Blizzard struck. This was not a normal storm. It was a weather event that would be spoken of for decades. The temperature, before wind chill, plummeted to 35 degrees post 37.2 degrees, and held for 6 days. The wind hit 60 miles per hour, creating a whiteout so total that visibility was less than 3 feet. At Silas Croft's railroad camp, the brute force system collapsed. The 60-millionty wind forced pressurized, super-chilled air through every crack in the chinking. The sound inside was a constant high-pitched whistle. The stove, burning at maximum capacity, devoured 1.5 cords of wood in just 6 days. The stovepipe itself became a problem. The exterior section cooled so rapidly that creosote froze, choking the draft. They had to cut a new hole in the roof just to vent the stove, which only let in more cold. The temperature inside the bunkhouse dropped to 15 degrees Celsius, 9.4 degrees Celsius. The men stopped working and simply huddled around the failing stove, burning furniture to stay alive. 2 men suffered severe frostbite on their feet and hands. At Wallace's cabin, the system thrived. The greater the temperature differential, the stronger the thermosiphon effect. The 35 degrees of air raced down the intake, and the 45 degrees of water battery worked tirelessly. The air emerging from the floor grate was still 35 degrees Celsius, 1.7 degrees Celsius. The earth just 200 feet below was oblivious to the blizzard. Wallace kept his masonry heater on its normal 4-hour-a-day burn schedule. The interior temperature never dropped below 58 degrees Celsius, 14.4 degrees Celsius. While the valley froze, he remained in his shirt sleeves, comfortable, cataloguing geological samples. On the 7th day, the storm broke. The silence was profound. Croft and his 3 remaining men, near starvation and half-frozen, saw the faint, clean wisp of smoke from Wallace's chimney, a sign of an efficient, hot burn, not the choked, sooty plume of a desperate fire. They stumbled the 3 miles, falling through drifts, arriving at his door as ghosts. Wallace took them in without a word. His tiny 12 by 16-foot cabin, just 192 square feet, was now sheltering 5 adult men. The system was immediately put under stress. The humidity from 5 men's breathing and drying clothes began to climb, fogging the single window. This was the system's next test, operational management. Wallace, the engineer, took charge. He wasn't just a builder, he was an operator. He explained that the air had to be vented. He opened a small, baffled roof vent, creating a controlled exhaust. This increased the draw on the geothermal loop, pulling more fresh, pre-warmed air from the shaft. He organized the men into shifts, 1 man awake at all times, not to feed the stove, which only needed fuel twice a day, but to monitor the vent, ensuring they had fresh air without losing too much heat. He managed the limited rations. Mr. Hayes, who had also taken refuge there with his wife, noted the profound difference. Croft's cabin had failed, becoming a toxic frozen box. Wallace's cabin, under load, simply functioned, providing a warm, dry, and most importantly, healthy environment. When the thaw finally came, Hayes was a man possessed. He wasn't just a surveyor, he was an agent of an industrial power. He returned to Denver and presented his findings not as a curiosity, but as an economic imperative. The railroad was losing thousands of dollars to lost man-hours, sickness, and above all, the staggering cost of cutting and transporting wood fuel to its high-altitude stations. He returned in the spring with a small engineering team. They descended the shaft. They took measurements. Water temperature at 190 feet, 45.1 degrees Celsius. Air temperature at intake, 48 degrees Celsius. It was May. Air temperature at floor grate, 46 degrees Celsius. The system also worked for passive cooling. Hayes's final report, the Wallace-Hayes Geothermal Siphon, a report on high-altitude thermal management, was a masterpiece of data. It detailed the airflow in cubic feet per minute, CFM, the precise temperature gain per foot of pipe, and the final calculation. Wallace's system provided an 85% reduction in fuel consumption and a 95% reduction in air infiltration compared to a standard Croft-style build. Silas Croft himself, humbled and frostbitten, was the first convert. He had seen the numbers, but he had felt the 58-degree air. The railroad, on Hayes's recommendation, hired Croft not to build his way, but to lead a construction crew under Wallace's technical direction to replicate the system. A visitor to the valley 2 years later, in 1901, would have seen the legacy. The new railroad roundhouse, built near the river, was a marvel. It had no massive stove, but its foundation was a labyrinth of 24-inch pipes, all running to a massive 300-foot deep air well that provided a constant 50-degree wafts of preheated air. The new miners' shacks that dotted the hills were no longer heavy log behemoths. They were light-framed envelopes, heavily insulated with sawdust and wool felt, and each was built over its own 50-foot air well drilled into the rock. Arthur Wallace was gone. The railroad had purchased the patent rights for his improvements for $5,000, a small fortune. He had taken the money and moved further west, seeking, perhaps, a new problem to solve. The 99-hundred cabin remained, a silent testament. The unbelievable secret in the basement was not gold or silver or a lost treasure. It was a working blueprint of applied thermodynamics. It was the simple, profound idea that in the face of the extreme, survival is not achieved by fighting the forces of nature, but by understanding and redirecting them. It was the knowledge that true strength is not measured in the thickness of one's walls, but in the intelligence of one's design.